Ellarkum vanakkam. In this video, I'm going to be talking about classes in Python. So a class is a structure in programming that's used to create objects, which I'll explain in a few seconds what that is. But essentially, it contains a range of properties that any object of that class could have. So two types of these properties include instance attributes and instance methods. So attributes are just any descriptor property, like if you were to describe a human, they would have a name, a hair color, an age, things like that. And attributes are also referred to as just properties, but I'm going to be talking about them as attributes. And there's also methods, which are more behavioral properties. So something that a human would do, like talking or eating, something like that. And methods are also similar to functions. They're just a different name, basically. But yeah, those are the two types of properties that a class generally has. And an object is an instance of a class. So when you hear the word instantiation, that's basically when an object is being created. And the difference between an object and a class is that an object has those properties specifically defined. So their hair color would be brown. And that's a defined property in an object. So why use classes? So classes are primarily used for object-oriented programming, which is a less procedural type of programming, and it's more object-based, as the name implies. And the benefits of using object-oriented programming is because when you do the procedural kind of programming with multiple functions and variables, it can get kind of complex and long and repetitive, and using object-oriented programming reduces the repetitiveness of the code, and it makes it easier to read and simpler overall, because each object will have its own defined functions, and you can create multiple of that same object without having to type up the function again and again. One common example of object-oriented programming and classes could be in video games. When you're creating, say, a character in the video game, it comes as a template. It has certain default properties, but then based on that, you can change certain properties that you would like. So you'll see how that is connected to classes. So I have one example of a class, the dog class. So in the dog class, certain examples of instance attributes you could have include the color, the name, the breed, the age. And you'll notice that these can be any data types. So the name and the color could be string data types, while the age would be int data type. So it doesn't matter. You can use any data type. And then the instance methods include something a dog would do, like bark, fetch, eat, walk. And I have an example, kind of a summary statement. So we could say Max, the 2-year-old black Labrador who barks, is an instance of the dog class. So those combination of properties makes up one object, one unique instance of the entire dog class. And any of the dogs on the screen could be a potential object of the dog class based on whether those properties are defined and how they're defined. So now getting specific to Python, how to define a class specifically in Python. So first you need that statement class, and then the class name and the colon. So the class name is usually written as uppercase. Like you'll see, I have the N uppercase, but and that's done so it's not confused with the method. I don't think necessarily you have to, like, it's not an error if you don't, but I think it's definitely widely done and better for readability for you if you do that. And then comes a constructor. So this is a specific type of method that's used to initialize a new object. I'm pretty sure many programming languages have this concept of a constructor. But specifically in Python, it's defined using the def keyword, like we learned about with functions, and then __ init __. So that's short for initialization, basically. And then you have parentheses, and then within that you have the keyword self. So this this keyword self is really important. It's always the first parameter in any class methods, and you always need it there, because it allows access to the object's attributes and methods. So don't worry if this sounds confusing now. Hopefully it'll make more sense when I show you the example. And so how to create an object. So to do this outside of the class, you would create an object name. It can be anything. And then you would call the class name. So you would call the class and then add any arguments if there are any. But one thing to note is you don't include self as an argument when you're creating the object. It's more of a placeholder in the definition of the class, not something you're inputting, the user's inputting. And also, you don't always need any arguments or parameters in a function, in a class. Obviously, it's useful based on what you're doing, but it's not necessary. But you do need that self parameter. And then you could also use dot notation to access the attributes and methods specific to that object. So I'll explain this more right after this, but if you want to call the attribute, you would do the object name dot that, whatever the attribute name is called. And then for the methods, you would do object name dot method. And then you need to include the parentheses and then any arguments if there are any within the parentheses. But again, you don't need those. But you do always need the parentheses to indicate that it's a method. So I will show you an example of the dog class in action on Python. So first you have the class statement, and so I named the class dog, and then the initialization statement. So here I have self, right? This always has to be the first parameter, and then I chose to include the three parameters that will be used for attributes. So these are things that the user would input. And then in order to tie these inputs into something that can be used in the class, you need to use the dot notation with self. So self.name equals name. And so an important thing to note is that this doesn't have to be the same like variable or word as whatever input, but it's recommended that you do that for readability sake and just to be clear. I mean, and it's easier when you're coding. But you have to use that dot notation with the self keyword in order to make it something usable within the class. And then here we have, so that was a constructor. This is a constructor. And then here we have the first instance method. So we have a method called bark. You could do multiple of these. And here I chose not to include any other parameters except for self because, you need that to access these three attributes. But there's no other parameters, but you could include them if you needed that. And then all this method does is prints out the name. Remember this formatting technique. So the name and then is age, years old, and likes to bark a lot. That's all this method does. You could make it do anything you want, but I just did this. And then here outside of the class, we create the first object. So I named my first object dog1. And then here you call the class and then you input the three arguments that we listed up here. So remember, you don't put anything in for self, but we have the name, age, and then the color. This statement creates the object. This creates the first object. And then here, now that the object is created, we can call the first instance method. And then to do that, we use the dot notation. So we have the object and then the name of the method, which is bark. And since there's no parameters, I didn't put anything in here. So it's just empty parentheses. If we run that, it'll automatically print. And then this line should print the name of the dog. So I wanted to access one of the attributes. So I did the object name dot the attribute name. And since it's an attribute, you don't need the parentheses since it's not a method. And there are no arguments. So run this. And then it prints out Max is 2 years old and likes to bark a lot. And then it accesses the dot name, which is Max. So this is just a really simple example of what a class would work as. So you can see there's a lot of variety with what you could do with this, ranging from simple stuff to very complex stuff. And yeah, it's kind of fun to play with, so definitely try it out. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for next week when we'll talk about files in Python.